Just how strong is China's reach in Europe? Beijing is pushing for a summit with a group of leaders this month. It's called the 17+1 and is meant to expand Chinese cooperation with Central and Eastern Europe. But does it add up to a challenge for European solidarity? This is Roundtable. Hello there, welcome to the show. I'm Shuli Ghosh. Late last year, China sealed a high-profile investment deal with the European Union. Now its focus is turning to Central and Eastern Europe nations, a group of 17 countries it started wooing back in 2012. A summit between China and the Central and Eastern European states, which was scheduled for last year, is now due to take place this month. The 17 plus China initiative countries include 12 EU member states and 5 Balkan states. But is there growing skepticism amongst many of these nations about China's relations with them? According to the Observer Research Foundation, a few years into the 17+1 framework, there is a growing discontent, given the slow progress in generating the desired economic results. For instance, a Budapest-Belgrade high-speed railway is part of China's flagship Belt and Road mega project, but construction hasn't started. And a nuclear power plant and hydropower plant in Romania have both yet to be completed. But for many less developed states in the 17+1 initiative, China's investment is still welcome, even with delays. So is China losing its charm in Central and Eastern Europe? And what is Beijing's strategy in those CEE countries? Well, joining us on the show today from Bratislava, Richard Turcsanyi, Director of the Strategic Policy Institute. Jeremy Garlick in Prague. He's an assistant professor of international studies who's written a book, China's Belt and Road. And Keegan Elmer joining us from Beijing, former Beijing correspondent for the South China Morning Post and researcher at the Helsinki Center for Global Political Economy. Gentlemen, good to have you with us on the show today. So Richard, let's start with you. Tell us more about the 17+1 initiative driven by China. The goal very much was about development and modernization in these 17 countries.
What we call now 17+1 started as 16+1 back in 2011, 2012, when Chinese Premier, at that time still Wen Jiabao, met for the first time in Warsaw in 2012, the prime ministers of 16 Central and Eastern European countries. And really, this setting of the countries met annually at the leaders level and also at many other levels and platforms. Supposedly, the goal was to make their economic relations more active. However, there have been a lot of suspicions regarding the platform, especially in the Western Europe, and many have called it
I was going to say, somewhere along the line, this initiative seems to have faltered, and these 17 countries, or some of these 17 countries, seem to have fallen out of love with China.
Yes, I think the big reason why that is the case is that little of the Chinese investment have materialized in most of these countries, and also the exports to China of these countries haven't really grown. So I would say for most CEE countries, these two issues have been the main goals, why they have been quite eager to start meeting China back in 2012. So since that didn't happen, they became a bit more frustrated.
Jeremy, I mean, the 17+1 initiative is seen very much as part of China's massive Belt and Road project. Did Beijing see it as easy access to Europe?
Yes, I think that was supposed to be the original goal of it, that the Central and Eastern Europe would be on the route from China to Europe, the overland route especially, which goes through Central Asia and Russia and then passes into Central and Eastern Europe before getting to Western Europe. And that obviously centers around a railway connection. So Central and Eastern Europe was supposed to be the gateway to Western Europe. But as I researched in my book, I mean, what I found when I looked at the Asian and European regions of the Belt and Road Initiative, which would include Central Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, and Central and Eastern Europe. Central and Eastern Europe is probably the least important for China because it's the furthest away. It hasn't got natural resources that the Chinese would require, like the Middle East has oil, obviously. What does Central and Eastern Europe have for them? So Central and Eastern Europe, although it looks like an access route to Western Europe, in fact, the Chinese have other routes such as ports in Western Europe. And as Richard has said already, I think investments in Central and Eastern Europe haven't been as high as expected. And in fact, if you look at the data, there have been far higher investments in Western Europe. So this idea of Central and Eastern Europe as a gateway to Western Europe so far hasn't really materialized.
Yeah, and the relationships with some of these countries has broken down. In fact, where you are in the Czech Republic, they've really turned against China. They've even gone looking to Taiwan for investment.
Yes, that's right. There's been, I think what happened was that President Xi Jinping visited Prague in 2016, and there had been a kind of warming of relations with the President Zeman in 2015. And there was a promise of a lot of investments coming in, but there were some investments. They bought a football club, they bought some property in central Prague, they invested in some media companies and so on. But these investments didn't really create any new jobs. They were just acquisitions of existing assets. And the company that was running the company that was organizing the investment, CEFC, later on they had cash flow problems. The chief financial officer was arrested. The CEO was detained in China, and those investments had to be taken over by a Chinese state-run company, CITIC. And as a consequence, of all these scandals and other scandals I could mention, but I won't, the Czech perception of China broke down, and around 2018, the perception had become poorer, and 2019 was a very poor year for relations before the coronavirus kicked off, where obviously everything has stalled even more. But
yeah. I think COVID-19's had a big impact on that. Keegan, China's promise to these countries was about modernization, about development, about infrastructure, but very few of these projects seem to have come to fruition. What's going on?
I think one of the problems that we've seen, just overall, China's outbound investment, its outbound loans, they've really taken a dive since around 2017, 18, 19, and especially into 2020 with the coronavirus situation. It's really interesting that China had a lot of promises and a lot of momentum behind its rise back in the time when the 16+1 and now the 17+1 first was initiated, and we've really seen kind of an interesting turn since then. I mean, and things aren't going to get any better. Just as Jeremy and Richard had said, trade. There's massive trade deficits between Central and Eastern Europe and China, and the investment isn't coming through, and that's not going to get any better in the next year to come, or possibly even longer. Chinese investors are definitely not going to be traveling to the Czech Republic or Poland or anything like that to invest in auto plants or anything with the coronavirus situation and travel restrictions the way they are. So, I mean, there's a lot of discontent within Europe as a whole, and Central and Eastern Europe in particular. And I really, especially from an economic perspective, don't see that really improving much in the future, especially in the ways that would actually help the economies in these countries. Things like agriculture exports or other things that would help boost the situation for Central and Eastern European countries. That's not really high on the menu or the list of priorities for the bilateral relationship at this point in terms of what's really feasible and what's possible. Those are difficult things, even though they would be good for the relationship. We won't expect them anytime soon.
Well, as you've mentioned, the COVID-19 crisis has had a big impact on relations between China and the rest of the world, let's face it. But there seems to have been a transformation of how EU countries view China and the challenges it poses. I'm going to show a graph to our viewers. This is a poll conducted by the Central European Institute. It shows how European countries view China. Sweden, France, Germany, the UK, they view China very unfavorably. Also the Czech Republic, as we've already said, and Hungary, both members of the 17+1. I mean, Keegan, where you are in Beijing, is there a sense that they are that Beijing's worried by this growing skepticism over its motives?
It is very clear now, I think, that China is, and Chinese thinkers are slowly coming around to the fact that Europe is increasingly worried and skeptical, not only of China, but also of the relationship of the 17+1 and these sort of sub-European platforms that China has an eye for. And this academic was actually saying, with this, considering the 17+1, China had considered in the past creating different regional platforms with Northern Europe and with Southern Europe, and pushing forward sort of sub-EU platforms that really doesn't make Brussels very happy. And this academic was saying, look, with all this skepticism rising in Europe, we need to focus on relationships with Europe as a whole and really just put a halt on these Northern and Southern European regional platforms. We're not, so we won't see any more 17+1s. Most likely, I think there's a less likely chance that we'll see the same sort of strategy, this sub-regional strategy diplomatically, or at least some people in Beijing are coming around to the fact that because of difficulties and headwinds that they're facing in Europe, they really need to focus on Europe as a whole and really tamp down on some of the skepticism that they're getting from Europe and address that.
But Richard, do you agree with that Beijing is moving to view Europe as a whole rather than concentrating on parts of it? Because I know it is trying to resurrect this 17+1 summit, isn't it? So is there some feeling that perhaps it's trying to divide opinion in Europe as to how to respond to its growing influence?
I think, and perhaps I also hope that in Beijing, more and more observers realize that there is growing skepticism around Europe. But when it comes to 17+1, I don't think that that the Chinese leaders would want to see something they have created as basically failing. I think that the 17+1 will continue. The question is in which capacity it will continue. So we will have to see, I guess next week or in 2 weeks, we will have the summit, and we'll see how many CEE leaders will show up. We'll see whether there will be any big announcements. And we'll see from there. But I certainly agree that when it comes to Southern Europe or Northern Europe, I don't expect that there will be any significant steps or new platforms going on there.
And what are your thoughts, Jeremy? Is China going to continue to try and bring back the 17 CEE countries, or is it now going to pivot and turn its focus more towards main European nations as a whole?
Well, I think China won't change course on Central and Eastern Europe. I think they will try to maintain the 17+1. They've committed some effort and time to this, and we have to remember also the political aspects of it, which is that China has seized the need for influence in Central and Eastern Europe, sees it as a bloc which it can perhaps influence more than Western Europe, because it's that these countries are not as developed as Western Europe, are not in the same position as Western Europe. I don't see China trying, it's not the talk of a divide and conquer strategy, and that China's trying to divide Europe into West and East. I don't think China sees it that way, but I do think that China wants to ensure that it has influence here, and to make sure, for example, in the United Nations, that it has backers, it has countries on its side. Whether it can achieve that, whether it can be politically viable that for China to gain support from Central and Eastern European countries, that's another matter. But we don't see signs of China changing course on its regional forums in other parts of the world, and I think China will try to pursue the same course here as well.
Is there more impetus, and I address this question to all of you, is there more impetus for China to increase its influence in Europe because of the trade war with the US and because of uncertainty over what might happen in the future under a Biden administration? Keegan, what do you think?
I think that's definitely true, and I think we've seen a lot of that already. The influence of the incoming Biden administration has really had it's brought a big opening for changes in relationship across the board, and especially in Europe. And I think in the run up to this 17+1 in particular, I think and actually we should maybe take it back to the CAI, the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment negotiations that were completed late last year. We saw a lot of sort of trepidation coming specifically from some of the Central and Eastern European countries about moving ahead too quickly with their investment agreement, European level investment agreement with China, in part, arguably, that because they were concerned that it would make the U.S. or certain people in the United States unhappy of getting a little bit too close to China at a time when the United States is in a time of transition. So some Central and European countries have arguably a much closer relationship than the United States and the U.S. for security reasons than the big countries of, for example, Germany and France and have. And I think it's arguable, and maybe we could talk about it more if you're interested, that when it comes to these big countries like Germany and France, in a lot of ways, have always accused some people in those countries have accused Central and Eastern European countries of dividing Europe and being too close to China. But I think from some of the dynamics that we saw of this investment agreement, is in this case, it's arguable that big countries like Germany and France are equally capable of sort of dividing a European line and weakening Brussels' position when it comes to China relations.
Okay.
So it's the interesting dynamics.
Let me put that to Richard. I saw you nodding through some of that. So what do you say about China's reasons for wanting to concentrate on Europe?
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize that, when China established 16+1, that was not kind of to pick this region, to focus on it as an alternative to Brussels. Quite the opposite. China was much more present, much more influential, and still is in the Western Europe. Its relations with Germany, with France, with the UK are way more developed. There is way more trade, way more investment going on. As Keegan mentioned, also when it comes to transatlantic relations, actually many CEE countries are closer to Washington than the Western European countries. So actually, Chinese attempt in Central Eastern Europe is not so much, or to put it in another way, it's more of an attempt to increase a little bit its influence in a region where really it was not present almost at all before 2012 or even before 2008.
Well, we've mentioned the trade deal with the EU bloc, the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. That had the backing of Germany and France. We know that those countries are much keener to engage with China despite concerns over human rights abuses or growing military influence. Jeremy, is there a worry amongst some European countries that others like France and Germany are too willing to do business with China? Is there a consensus that there needs to be a more unified approach towards China?
Well, I'm not sure that there's any consensus. I think, what I was saying before about divide and conquer, I think there's no need for China, or there's no purpose in China dividing and conquering Europe, because Europe seems to me is doing a good job of dividing and conquering itself. I mean, there's a lack of unity in the European Union. And that what you've just said about France and Germany, and are they getting too close to China? There's certainly a lot of concern among a lot of Czech elites and Czech people about the human rights record in China. I mean, that's something that I deal with my students, and they're very concerned about this, the Czech students. So there's a lot of concern on that front, and I don't see a united front, though, about the French and German position. I think that debate hasn't really started properly yet. I mean, I think everybody's preoccupied with the current pandemic. So once we get through that, perhaps there'll be a bit more discussion, debate about those type of questions.
Yeah. Even as I heard the words consensus and European Union coming out of my mouth, I knew that wasn't really going to work. This is what the EU Foreign Affairs spokesman Josep Borrell says. He says, unity is vital in every area of our relationship with Beijing, because no European country is on its own capable of defending its interests and values against a country the size and might of China. I guess the problem is that right now, economic concerns are hugely weighing on a lot of countries, particularly with the coronavirus pandemic. And economic links with China are going to be extremely important in the future. So, Richard, does that present is that problematic in terms of balancing financial links with China, but not wanting to allow it to extend unduly its influence?
You know, when we are talking about the investment agreement, I don't think it should perhaps be presented as a strictly economic deal. And I don't think that even the Brussels elite and the Commission and so on would perceive it in this way. I think there is a consideration that obviously it has political implications, it has geopolitical implications. At the end, this Commission explicitly mentioned it wants to be the geopolitical Commission. So I think the whole investment deal can also be perceived from the perspective of, the strategic autonomy of the EU, which is often being discussed. And obviously, there is a new American president, which is more open to cooperation with the EU, which is more willing to participate in global governance. But I think some suspicions in the EU persist. And many Europeans still think that perhaps the EU should strengthen its strategic autonomy. And I think that investment deal with Beijing is seen as a step in this direction. So not only economically speaking, but also politically. Because at the end, the EU recognizes that to address many global issues, including climate change, but also counterterrorism and others, the EU simply has to do with Beijing. So the confrontational approach which Washington has chosen in recent years, I think this approach is not so welcome around Europe, in Brussels, Berlin, Paris, elsewhere.
Do you agree with that, Keegan? And do you think that China can bring Europe more on side, particularly with the prospect perhaps of providing its the Chinese coronavirus vaccine?
Well, when it comes to the vaccine politics, that's a whole other can of worms.
Well, it's a useful tool, though, isn't it? If you're trying to get other countries to engage with you.
Well, that's true. Although, if you look at the way that vaccine politics work right now, I mean, I'll tell you, I'm about to fly back to Finland and try to come back to China here in Beijing, and there's no real recognition of the validity of other vaccines. So, for example, it's not clear if you take another vaccine in another country whether or not China will accept that particular vaccine for you to come back and enter the country, and whether that will be safe, because China has the coronavirus situation pretty well controlled at this point. And I think the vaccine situation, I'm sure that it will be important that for China's relationship with the rest of the world to continue to be a supplier of PPE and quite possibly vaccines all over the world, most definitely vaccines all over the world, but that may not necessarily help them. I think, as we can see from the research that Richard and his colleagues have all done, the sort of what's been called mask diplomacy, or China's efforts to sort of use its coronavirus battling strength, has not necessarily equated to positive views of China within Central and Eastern Europe. I think. Okay. Go ahead. Sorry. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to put a last question to Jeremy. If China gets this 17+1 summit going as it says it wants to, virtually or otherwise, do you think the Czech Republic is going to attend? And is there any chance that it will come round to Chinese investment in the future?
Well, I think the Czechs will certainly attend. Everybody will attend because they don't want to miss out on an possible opportunity. But I can't see, this, as far as I understand it, the forum is going to take place online over the course of a few hours. I can't see that a few hours online in an online forum is going to really change the situation drastically. If it was face to face, there might be more opportunity for some some improvement of relations. I think you have to we have to say that the Czech leaders at the top are not necessarily anti-China. For example, President Zeman is certainly pro-China, and that's why the relations took off. But there is a lot of feeling of we shouldn't commit too much to China. I think as returning to what Keegan was talking about with the vaccine, I think in the Czech Republic, there would be very little enthusiasm for Chinese vaccine. Even the Chinese PPE that was delivered here, there were some negative stories in the press about the poor quality of it. So I think there'll be very little kind of enthusiasm for Chinese vaccine, and improving Chinese relations with China. The Czech politicians have to be very careful not to run against public opinion.
Gentlemen, it's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on Roundtable. Richard, Jeremy and Keegan, thank you. And you can see more discussion on our YouTube channel. Search for TRT World Roundtable. But for now, from me and all the team here in London, bye-bye. Thanks for watching.